The rain hammered against Dr. Marcus Chen's windows with the persistence of someone demanding entry, which made the actual knocking at his door seem almost polite by comparison. He glanced at his chronometer, 11:47 p.m., and wondered who could possibly need to visit a xenolinguist during what meteorologists were calling the worst storm to hit New Geneva colony in decades. Through his security display, he could see a figure huddled against his doorframe, soaked through and shivering in clothes that looked more like rags than proper weather gear. The individual appeared to be female, humanoid but clearly non-human based on the elegant pointed ears visible, despite her bedraggled state. Marcus hesitated, his academic caution warring with basic human decency. Opening his door to unknown aliens during a storm could lead to complications ranging from immigration violations to personal safety issues. On the other hand, leaving someone to freeze in his doorway would violate every principle he'd learned during his 20 years of studying alien cultures. Basic decency 1. He opened the door. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held exhaustion and something approaching desperation, but also a strange kind of dignity that persisted despite her obviously dire circumstances. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder, with the kind of delicate bone structure that suggested her species had evolved under different gravitational conditions than Earth standard. "Please," she said in heavily accented standard Galactic, then seemed to catch herself and fall silent. Marcus stepped aside to let her enter, noting how she moved with careful precision despite her obvious fatigue. Once inside, she turned to face him and did something he'd never experienced before. She began communicating through an elaborate series of gestures that told a complete story without words. First, she pointed to herself and made a sweeping gesture that encompassed his entire living space. Then she mimed cooking motions, complete with stirring and tasting gestures that somehow conveyed competence and enthusiasm. Next came cleaning movements, dusting, organizing, scrubbing, performed with the efficiency of someone who took pride in such work. Finally, and most intriguingly, she placed her finger over her lips in the universal gesture for silence, then pointed to herself again and nodded solemnly. The message was clear. She would cook, clean, and remain quiet in exchange for shelter. Marcus found himself staring at her, trying to process this unprecedented negotiation. "You're offering to be my housekeeper in exchange for a place to stay." She nodded enthusiastically, then repeated her gestures with slight variations that seemed to emphasize her reliability and discretion. When she finished, she looked at him with hopeful expectation, clearly waiting for his decision. Marcus's apartment reflected the domestic skills of someone whose idea of home maintenance involved ignoring problems until they became impossible to overlook. His kitchen contained more takeout containers than actual food. His laundry situation had reached crisis levels, and his research materials were scattered across every available surface in what he generously called organized chaos. "I don't usually," he began, then stopped. What exactly didn't he usually do? Harbor refugee aliens, accept housekeeping services from strangers, make life-changing decisions based on pantomimed conversations during thunderstorms. The woman waited patiently for his response, occasionally glancing toward his kitchen, with an expression that suggested she was already mentally cataloging the improvements she could make to his clearly inadequate food storage system. "1 week," Marcus said finally. "Trial basis. You can stay 1 week and we'll see how this arrangement works out." Her smile transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth that had been hidden beneath exhaustion and desperation. She placed both hands over her heart in what he assumed was a gesture of gratitude, then immediately began removing her soaked outer garments with the practical efficiency of someone accustomed to making the best of difficult circumstances. "I'm Marcus," he said, pointing to himself. "Dr. Marcus Chen." She pointed to herself and made a sound that resembled Nira, then immediately covered her mouth as if she'd violated their agreement about silence. Marcus held up a hand to indicate that introductions were probably acceptable under their arrangement. Nira, he repeated, and her pleased expression suggested he'd pronounced it correctly. What followed was the most efficient domestic transformation Marcus had ever witnessed. Despite being exhausted, wet, and working with unfamiliar equipment, Nira managed to assess his living situation and begin improvements that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness. His food synthesizer, which had been producing meals that tasted like cardboard mixed with disappointment, suddenly began creating dishes that actually resembled the photographs in its programming database. His laundry, which had been reproducing through some unknown process in various corners of his apartment, disappeared into his cleaning unit and emerged as properly folded, organized clothing. Most remarkably, Nira seemed to understand his research patterns without any explanation. She organized his linguistic analysis materials in ways that made his work more efficient, while never disturbing his active projects or disrupting his note-taking systems. By morning, Marcus woke to the smell of actual breakfast, not synthesized protein paste, but something that involved eggs and bread and herbs that made his kitchen smell like a place where people actually lived rather than merely survived. Nira presented his meal with obvious pride, then settled into a corner of his kitchen with her own plate, eating quietly while he marveled at food that tasted like it had been prepared by someone who understood the difference between nutrition and cuisine. "This is incredible," Marcus said, forgetting their silence agreement in his enthusiasm for the best breakfast he'd eaten in years. Nira smiled and made a small gesture that seemed to acknowledge his praise while gently reminding him that she preferred to maintain their agreed-upon quiet. She finished her meal, cleared both their dishes, and immediately began what appeared to be a systematic assessment of his apartment's organizational needs. Marcus watched her work while pretending to focus on his linguistic analysis, fascinated by the way she moved through his space with growing familiarity. She touched nothing without obvious purpose, disturbed no research materials without clear improvement in mind, and maintained the promised silence except for soft humming that somehow made his sterile apartment feel more like home. By the end of the first day, Marcus realized that his spontaneous decision to shelter a stranger during a storm had fundamentally altered his living situation. His apartment was cleaner, his meals were better, and his research space was more organized than it had been since he'd moved to New Geneva Colony. More intriguingly, Nira's presence had brought a sense of companionship he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Even her silence felt comfortable rather than awkward, like sharing space with someone who understood the value of quiet concentration, punctuated by moments of shared appreciation for small domestic pleasures. As he settled into sleep that night in an apartment that smelled like home-cooked food and felt like a place where someone actually cared about comfort rather than mere functionality, Marcus found himself hoping that their trial arrangement would prove mutually beneficial. Some storms, he reflected, brought unexpected gifts along with their destruction. 3 weeks had passed since the storm brought Nira to his doorstep, and Marcus had reluctantly admitted that their arrangement had evolved into something he'd never expected to want. His apartment had transformed from academic chaos into something resembling an actual home, complete with meals that made him look forward to eating and an organization system that somehow made his research more efficient without interfering with his methodology. Nira maintained her bargain with almost religious devotion. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, usually single-word questions like "more," when serving meals or "here," when organizing his materials. Her silence had become comfortable rather than awkward, filled with a communication system of gestures, expressions, and small sounds that conveyed surprisingly complex information. This morning's breakfast featured eggs prepared in a style Marcus didn't recognize but definitely approved of, served alongside bread that somehow tasted fresh despite coming from his standard food synthesizer. Nira sat across from him with her own meal, reading one of his linguistic journals with obvious interest, while maintaining the careful distance their arrangement required. "That's advanced phonetic theory," Marcus observed, noting the article she was examining. "Pretty dry stuff for casual reading." Neera looked up with an expression that seemed to suggest the material was anything but dry to her, then caught herself, and returned to the studied neutrality she maintained during their interactions. She pointed to a particular passage and made a questioning sound. Marcus leaned over to see what had caught her attention. "Ah, that's Veridian's work on temporal linguistic structures. Controversial theory that language evolution follows predictable patterns based on cognitive development stages." Neera nodded thoughtfully, then made a series of gestures that seemed to indicate agreement with some aspects of the theory and skepticism about others. Her commentary, though wordless, demonstrated understanding that went well beyond casual interest. "You've studied linguistics?" Marcus asked, then immediately felt foolish for expecting a verbal response. Instead of answering, Neera stood and moved to his research desk, where she began organizing his materials with the same systematic approach she applied to everything else. But this time, Marcus noticed something different. She was arranging his comparative analysis charts in a way that highlighted patterns he'd missed, grouping related concepts with an intuitive understanding that suggested formal training rather than casual observation. The morning routine was interrupted by his door chime, announcing an unexpected visitor. Marcus checked his security display and felt his stomach drop. Dr. Sarah Kim stood outside, holding what appeared to be a data case and wearing the expression of someone who decided to conduct an unscheduled academic consultation. "Sarah," Marcus said, opening the door while trying to look casually pleased rather than panicked. "This is unexpected. I was in the area reviewing colony linguistic documentation and thought I'd stop by," Sarah replied, stepping into his apartment with the confident familiarity of a 20-year friendship. "I wanted to discuss your latest paper on morphological adaptation patterns." Marcus glanced around his apartment, noting that while Neera had vanished with impressive speed, evidence of her presence remained everywhere. The lingering scent of real cooking, an organization system that was clearly beyond his capabilities, and domestic improvements that would be impossible to explain as solo achievements. "Your place looks different," Sarah observed, examining his kitchen with obvious surprise. "When did you learn to keep house like a functional adult?" "I've been making an effort," Marcus said, which was technically true if incomplete. "Figured it was time to get my domestic situation under control." Sarah opened his food synthesizer and stared at the settings display. "Marcus, this thing is calibrated for gourmet meal production. Last time I was here, you were subsisting on protein paste and synthetic fruit." "YouTube tutorials," Marcus improvised. "Amazing what you can learn from instructional videos." From somewhere in his apartment came the soft sound of movement, barely audible, but enough to make Sarah turn toward the source with curiosity. Marcus coughed loudly, hoping to mask any additional sounds from Neera's efforts to remain hidden. "Are you feeling all right?" Sarah asked. "You seem nervous about something." "Just surprised by the visit," Marcus replied. "You know how I am with unexpected social interactions." Sarah settled into his reading chair, which had somehow acquired comfortable cushions since her last visit, and activated her data pad. "I wanted to discuss some inconsistencies I've noticed in your recent work. Your linguistic analysis has become remarkably sophisticated over the past month." Marcus felt sweat forming despite his apartment's comfortable temperature. "Sophisticated how?" "Your pattern recognition has improved dramatically, and you're identifying grammatical structures that typically require years of specialized study to detect." Sarah consulted her notes. "This paper on Ithrani temporal conjugation patterns is graduate-level work in xenolinguistic theory. I've been focusing more intensively on my research," Marcus said, which was true. Neera's domestic efficiency had freed up considerable time for academic work. Marcus, Some of these insights require cultural knowledge that isn't available through standard academic sources. You're writing about linguistic patterns that suggest deep familiarity with alien thought processes. From the direction of his bedroom came what sounded suspiciously like a muffled sneeze, followed by complete silence that somehow felt more obvious than the original sound. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, looking around with growing attention. "Hear what?" It sounded like. Sarah paused, clearly trying to identify the source of her suspicion. "Marcus, are you living with someone?" "Living with someone." Marcus attempted laughter that came out more like a nervous cough. "You know me better than that. I'm barely capable of living with myself." Sarah stood and began examining his apartment with the systematic approach of someone who detected inconsistencies that demanded investigation. She opened his closet and found clothes that were organized with military precision. She checked his kitchen and discovered cooking implements that showed signs of regular, competent use. She examined his research area and found organizational systems that clearly exceeded his natural capabilities. "Marcus Chen," she said with the tone of someone who'd solved a puzzle, "you've hired domestic help." "I wouldn't call it hired exactly," Marcus admitted, relief flooding through him at finding a partial truth he could work with. "What would you call it?" "More of a mutual assistance arrangement. I provide accommodation, and she helps with household management." Sarah's expression shifted to interest mixed with concern. "Marcus, please tell me you're not involved in some kind of exploitative labor situation." "Nothing exploitative," Marcus said quickly. "It's completely voluntary. She needed a place to stay, I needed help with domestic organization. Mutually beneficial arrangement." "Where is she now?" "Running errands," Marcus improvised. "Very discreet person, prefers to avoid social interactions." Sarah consulted her chronometer. "It's barely past breakfast time. What kind of errands require such early morning attention?" Before Marcus discovered Nira crying at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, her silent tears illuminated by the glow from his research terminal, where she sat surrounded by scattered linguistic analysis charts. She looked up when his footsteps creaked on the apartment's aging floor, immediately trying to wipe away evidence of her distress while maintaining the careful composure their arrangement required. "Can't sleep either?" Marcus asked softly, settling into the chair across from her without making direct reference to her tears. Nira shook her head, then gestured toward the news feed displaying on his secondary monitor. The headlines scrolled past in the mechanical routine of overnight information cycles. "Immigration enforcement increases colony sweeps." "Undocumented alien arrests rise 300% this quarter." "New legislation targets refugee integration programs." "Worried about the enforcement actions?" Marcus asked. She nodded, then did something that broke their weeks-old pattern of careful silence. She spoke. "Agreement was silence," Nira said, in carefully precise standard Galactic that carried only the slightest accent. "But silence does not help when fear makes thinking impossible." Marcus felt his worldview shift as her voice filled the space between them. After weeks of communication through gestures and expressions, hearing her speak felt like discovering that his apartment contained hidden rooms he'd never suspected. "You speak standard Galactic perfectly," he observed. "Perfectly is overstatement," Nira replied with what might have been gentle humor. "But adequately for most purposes, yes." "Why the silence, then?" "I mean, besides our original agreement." Nira looked toward his news display, where immigration enforcement statistics continued scrolling past in bureaucratic monotony. Undocumented aliens who draw attention to themselves through unusual behavior become priority targets for investigation. Silence means invisible. Invisible means safe. And speaking makes you visible. Speaking reveals education level, linguistic sophistication, cognitive capabilities that suggest value beyond domestic labor. Nira's expression carried sadness mixed with pragmatic understanding. Educated refugees ask questions, make demands, possess knowledge that authorities consider either valuable or threatening. Marcus began connecting pieces that he should have recognized weeks ago. You're not just educated. You're professionally trained in linguistics. Nira corrected softly. Past tense carries important distinction from present reality. What happened? Nira stood and moved to his kitchen, beginning preparations for what appeared to be late-night tea, with the focused attention of someone using familiar tasks to manage emotional turbulence. Marcus waited, sensing that pushing for immediate answers would violate the trust she was extending by finally speaking honestly. My world, Veltara Prime, developed linguistic research that government declared culturally destabilizing, she said while arranging tea service with characteristic precision. Interspecies communication theory that suggested barriers between civilizations are artificial constructs rather than natural divisions. That sounds like valuable research, not dangerous ideology. Valuable to academics, dangerous to political systems that maintain power through cultivating fear of other species. Nira's tone carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to discuss persecution without revealing the full emotional cost. Research that proves communication bridges can exist between any sufficiently motivated civilizations threatens economies built on interspecies conflict. Marcus felt his academic instincts engaging with the theoretical implications of her work. You were studying practical applications of universal linguistic principles. Developing them, Nira corrected. Successfully, created translation protocols that worked across species barriers previously considered insurmountable. And your government considered this threatening. Government considered this eliminative to their authority structure. Nira served tea that somehow tasted like comfort and home despite being produced from Marcus's basic synthesizer. Political systems that depend on us versus them mentality cannot survive proof that them is artificial category. So they shut down your research. Shut down research, arrested research team. Declared findings classified state secrets. Nira's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see tension in her posture that suggested the memory carried trauma she wasn't expressing. Some team members accepted forced reassignment to military applications. Others disappeared into detention facilities. And you? I ran, Nira said simply. Took research data and ran before arrest warrant processed. Coward's choice, but effective for maintaining freedom if not dignity. Marcus stared at her, reassessing everything about their arrangement through the lens of her revelation. Nira, you're not a domestic worker seeking shelter. You're a political refugee with research that could revolutionize interspecies relations. Was political refugee with revolutionary research, she corrected. Now I'm undocumented alien offering household services in exchange for basic accommodation. Present tense again carries important distinction. But your knowledge, your capabilities, become irrelevant when legal status prevents acknowledgement of professional qualifications. Nira's expression mixed frustration with acceptance of practical limitations. Dr. Nira Velter published groundbreaking papers on linguistic bridge theory. Nira, the housekeeper, stays silent and invisible to avoid deportation to detention facilities. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest at the waste of her talents and the injustice of her situation. How many other refugees are hiding similar backgrounds? More than comfortable societies prefer to acknowledge, Nira replied. Brilliant minds reduced to manual labor, advanced researchers pretending illiteracy, former professors cleaning floors in exchange for permission to exist without documentation. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the implications of her revelation. Marcus found himself reconsidering every interaction they'd had over the past weeks, recognizing moments where her responses had demonstrated knowledge and insight far beyond what her domestic role would suggest. Your improvements to my research organization, he said finally, Those weren't intuitive domestic skills. You were applying professional expertise. Organization principles remain consistent across disciplines, Neera replied diplomatically. Linguistic analysis requires same systematic approaches as household management. Neera, your insights could advance my work by decades. We could collaborate openly, develop applications of your theoretical framework. Could, Neera agreed. In hypothetical universe where undocumented aliens receive work permits and political asylum cases process in reasonable timeframes. In this universe, collaboration reveals my background to authorities who will either exploit my knowledge or eliminate me as security risk. Marcus realized that their comfortable arrangement had been concealing a tragedy of wasted potential that extended far beyond individual circumstances. What would you need to feel safe enough to work openly? Legal status that acknowledges rights rather than merely tolerating presence, Neera said. Protection from government agents who view educated refugees as either assets to be controlled or threats to be eliminated. Political asylum applications exist for exactly these situations. Political asylum applications require extensive documentation, lengthy legal proceedings, and survival during investigation periods that often exceed years. Neera's tone suggested she'd researched these options thoroughly, during which time applicant remains vulnerable to detention, deportation, or disappearance into bureaucratic systems designed to discourage rather than protect. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's security alert indicating movement in the building's common areas. Both of them tensed, listening to footsteps in the hallway that sounded more official than residential. Immigration sweep, Neera whispered, her face going pale. They conduct surprise inspections during early morning hours when residents are least prepared to hide irregularities. Marcus felt his protective instincts engage with unexpected intensity. You need to hide. Hiding only delays discovery, does not prevent it. Neera moved toward his bedroom with efficient speed, clearly having planned for this possibility. If they scan apartment thoroughly, my biological traces will be detected regardless of physical concealment. Then we need a different approach. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities as official voices echoed from the building's lobby. Their arrangement had evolved from simple shelter into something approaching partnership. But partnership implied equality. The immigration officers at Marcus's door wore expressions that suggested routine inspection, had become focused investigation. Their scanning equipment already activated before he'd finished opening the entry panel. Officer Rodriguez consulted her tablet while her partner, Officer Park, began systematic examination of Marcus's living space with the thoroughness of someone expecting to find exactly what they were looking for. Dr. Chen, Rodriguez said with professional courtesy that carried underlying authority. We're conducting residential compliance verification in response to reports of irregular activity in this sector. What kind of irregular activity? Marcus asked, stepping aside to allow their entry while hoping his nervousness could be attributed to normal citizen anxiety rather than specific guilt about harboring undocumented residents. Elevated biological traces suggesting undisclosed occupancy, unusual consumption patterns indicating multiple residents, and electromagnetic signatures consistent with advanced technological integration. Rodriguez's scanner beeped insistently as she moved through his apartment. Your residence shows all these indicators, Dr. Chen. From his study came the sound of movement, followed by Neera's appearance in the doorway. She wore one of Marcus's academic conference shirts over her usual clothes, carried a data pad displaying linguistic analysis charts, and projected the confident bearing of someone engaged in legitimate scholarly work rather than someone hiding from authorities. Dr. Chen, she said in precisely modulated standard Galactic, The comparative analysis of Veltaran temporal structures is showing interesting correlations with your earlier work on morphological adaptation patterns. Both officers turned to stare at her with obvious surprise. Rodriguez consulted her scanner, which was providing readings that clearly didn't match expectations for standard residential inspection. "And you are?" Rodriguez asked. "Dr. Nira Velter," she replied with the kind of academic formality that Marcus recognized from professional conferences. "Visiting research fellow collaborating with Dr. Chen on interspecies linguistic bridge theory." "Visiting from where?" Park interjected, his own scanner registering readings that were making him frown at his equipment. "Currently between formal institutional affiliations due to political situation on my homeworld," Nira replied smoothly. "Dr. Chen has graciously provided workspace while I seek asylum status and university sponsorship." Marcus felt his admiration for her increasing as she navigated the conversation with perfect balance of truth and misdirection. Everything she'd said was accurate while presenting their situation in ways that transformed domestic arrangement into academic collaboration. Political asylum. Rodriguez looked between Marcus and Nira with growing interest. "Dr. Velter, do you have documentation of your asylum application?" "Application is in process," Nira replied. "Current status is preliminary review pending formal interview scheduling." This was news to Marcus, but he maintained expression of someone whose research partner had kept him informed of bureaucratic developments. Rodriguez made notes on her tablet while Park continued scanning Marcus's apartment with equipment that seemed increasingly confused by whatever it was detecting. "Dr. Chen," Park said, "your residence shows technological modifications that exceed standard residential parameters. Advanced food synthesis programming, communication systems with enhanced encryption capabilities, and data processing improvements that suggest professional-grade equipment integration." Dr. Velter's expertise includes technological applications of linguistic theory, Marcus explained, which was true if incomplete. "Her research requires sophisticated analytical tools that have enhanced my existing equipment capabilities." "Enhanced how?" Rodriguez asked. Nira stepped forward with the confidence of someone presenting research findings to peer review committee. "Linguistic analysis algorithms optimized for cross-species pattern recognition, communication protocols designed for universal translation applications, and data synthesis methods that identify structural similarities across disparate language families." She activated Marcus's main display, which immediately began showing linguistic analysis charts that demonstrated complexity far beyond his individual capabilities. The visual presentation was impressive enough to make both officers pause their interrogation to examine the theoretical frameworks being illustrated. "This is groundbreaking work," Rodriguez admitted, consulting her scanner with obvious puzzlement. "Dr. Velter, your research applications could revolutionize interspecies communication protocols. Precisely why political asylum case deserves expedited consideration," Nira replied. "Research of this significance benefits galactic civilization, but only if researcher receives protection from political persecution that forced departure from homeworld." Marcus watched the interaction with growing appreciation for Nira's strategic intelligence. She was transforming their inspection from immigration violation investigation into academic achievement recognition, using her genuine expertise to reframe their entire relationship in ways that made their partnership seem not just legitimate, but valuable to broader society. "Dr. Chen," Park said, "how long has Dr. Velter been collaborating on your research?" "Several weeks," Marcus replied truthfully. "Her insights have accelerated my work in ways that would have taken years to achieve independently." "And her residential situation? Temporary accommodation while asylum paperwork processes and university sponsorship arrangements finalize," Marcus said, following Neera's lead in presenting their domestic arrangement as academic convenience rather than humanitarian necessity. Rodriguez consulted her communication device, apparently checking something against official databases. Dr. Velter, our records show no active asylum application under your name. Marcus felt tension spike, but Neera responded without hesitation. Applications submitted through legal advocate Dr. Sarah Kim of Refugee Rights Consortium. Processing delays are unfortunately common for cases involving politically sensitive research applications. Dr. Sarah Kim, Rodriguez repeated, making additional notes. We can verify that through official channels. What she didn't know, and what Marcus hoped she wouldn't discover immediately, was that Sarah Kim had received an emergency communication from Marcus less than an hour ago requesting expedited legal representation for exactly this situation. Whether Sarah had managed to file preliminary paperwork in that timeframe was unknown, but Neera's confident reference suggested she was betting on their friend's professional competence. Park's scanner emitted a different tone, one that seemed to indicate successful identification rather than continued confusion. Commander, these biological traces are consistent with Veltaran physiology, and the technological improvements show signatures that match documented capabilities of that species' educational system. Educational system. Rodriguez looked up from her tablet with interest. Veltaran academic training emphasizes technological integration as standard research methodology, Neera explained. What appears as advanced modification to your equipment represents basic analytical tools from my educational background, meaning this level of technological sophistication is normal for your species' academic work. Normal for individuals with formal linguistic research training, yes. Neera's tone carried the patient courtesy of someone explaining elementary concepts to interested non-specialists. Dr. Chen's equipment now operates at efficiency levels that would be considered adequate by Veltaran educational standards. Marcus realized she was simultaneously complimenting his hospitality and establishing that her presence represented academic upgrade rather than illegal immigration. The officers were beginning to look less like enforcement agents and more like people who'd stumbled into something beyond their usual investigative experience. Dr. Velter, Rodriguez said finally, your asylum application will need to be verified through proper channels, but your research collaboration appears legitimate. Dr. Chen, you'll need to ensure proper documentation is filed for any long-term academic partnerships. Of course, Marcus agreed, hoping that Sarah Kim was indeed working on making their improvised legal status into actual paperwork. We're committed to maintaining full compliance with academic collaboration regulations. After the officers departed, Marcus and Neera sat in silence for several minutes, both processing what had just occurred. Their carefully maintained domestic arrangement had transformed into public academic partnership with legal implications neither had fully anticipated. That was brilliant improvisation, Marcus said finally. That was desperate preservation of arrangement that has become more important to me than professional caution would recommend, Neera replied. Also, Dr. Sarah Kim will probably require extensive explanation of situation we have created using her legal credentials. She'll under 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in the observation deck of the ancient station, watching shuttle after shuttle arrive from both human and Voltarian space. The discovery of the architect's records had triggered the fastest interspecies cooperation effort in recorded history, with both governments apparently deciding that 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom was worth setting aside their usual diplomatic caution. The xenoarchaeology team from Earth University arrived this morning, Zara reported, joining him at the viewport. Her bioluminescence had settled into steady, contented patterns since she'd been spending most of her time interfaced with the station's systems, helping to translate and catalog the architect's vast databases. Professor Chen says the historical records alone will revolutionize our understanding of galactic civilization development. And the Voltarian delegation. They're particularly excited about the biotechnology integration techniques. The architects found ways to merge organic and technological systems that my people have been theorizing about for generations. Marcus nodded, watching another transport dock with the station's expanded port facilities. The keepers had been remarkably accommodating about the sudden influx of researchers, apparently delighted to finally have someone to share the architect's legacy with after 10 millennia of patient waiting. Any word from our respective governments about what happens next? That's complicated. Zara's luminescence shifted to patterns that Marcus had learned, indicated she was working through diplomatic complexities. Officially, both sides want to establish a joint research facility to study the architect's technology and records. Unofficially, there are quite a few people on both sides who think we should be extracting anything militarily useful and keeping it away from potential enemies. By potential enemies, I assume they mean each other. Among others, yes. Marcus had been dreading this conversation, but the arrival of official delegations had made it inevitable. For 2 weeks, he and Zara had been the sole human-Voltarian partnership with access to the station's systems, working together to unlock secrets that could benefit both their species. Now they were about to become small parts in a much larger political and scientific apparatus. So what happens to us? Do we get reassigned to different projects, or do they keep the team that made the initial contact? That depends on several factors, including whether our respective governments decide that continued human-Voltarian partnerships are politically advisable, and if they decide they're not. Zara was quiet for a moment, her bioluminescence cycling through subdued patterns that Marcus was learning to recognize as sadness. Then, we go back to our separate services and hope that the politicians don't find ways to turn the architect's wisdom into new reasons for conflict. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. They discovered the records of a civilization that had achieved incredible things through cooperation and understanding, only to have their own governments approach those discoveries with the same territorial instincts that had led to the architect's downfall. There might be another option, he said, an idea crystallizing that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if we don't let them split us up? How do you mean? The keepers have been looking for someone to help them preserve and share the architect's legacy, right? What if we volunteer for permanent assignment? Joint Human-Voltarian Research Partnership, stationed here full-time, answerable to both governments but not controlled by either one. Zara's eyes shifted through several color phases as she processed the implications. It would be unprecedented. A permanent interspecies research mission with autonomous authority over first contact protocols and ancient technology access. Is that a diplomatic way of saying it's impossible? No, it's a diplomatic way of saying it's so unprecedented that it might actually work. Neither government would want to be seen as the one preventing important scientific cooperation, especially when the alternative is arguing over who gets to control 10,000 years of advanced alien knowledge. Their conversation was interrupted by the station's communication system, which had developed the habit of announcing important developments with harmonies that sounded like cosmic wind chimes having philosophical discussions. Attention researchers, the keeper's voice flowed through the station's corridors. We have received a priority transmission from the Galactic Communication Network. Multiple species have detected the energy signatures from our recent defensive demonstration. Delegations are requesting permission to visit and learn about the architect's legacy. Marcus and Zara looked at each other, sharing the same realization. The discovery of the architect's station wasn't just going to change human-Voltarian relations. It was going to become the foundation for the first truly interspecies cooperative research effort in galactic history. Well, Marcus said, watching more ships appear on the long-range sensors, I guess we're about to find out if the galaxy is ready for the kind of cooperation the architects believed in. Are you nervous? Zara asked. Terrified, Marcus admitted, but also excited. 2 weeks ago, my biggest concern was whether my coffee maker would survive another asteroid field. Now we're potentially looking at helping to establish the first intergalactic research consortium. It's going to be complicated. The best things usually are. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same observation deck, but now it looked out over a bustling spaceport that hosted researchers, diplomats, and scholars from 17 different species. The Architects' Research Consortium had become everything they'd hoped and more. A collaborative effort that focused on understanding and applying ancient wisdom, rather than competing for technological advantages. Zara joined him, her bioluminescence now carrying harmonics that seemed to blend with the station's own energy patterns. She'd become the primary interface between the keepers and the various research teams, her unique abilities making her invaluable for accessing and translating the most complex architect technologies. The Centauri delegation just arrived, she reported. They're particularly interested in the architects' approaches to sustainable energy generation and the progress on the defensive network. 3 more stations have been